What if everything we think we know about ancient technology is wrong? What if somewhere beneath the waves lies proof that our ancestors weren't primitive cave dwellers struggling with stone tools, but masters of sciences we're only now beginning to rediscover? Tonight, we're diving into the deepest mystery of human civilization, not just the legend of Atlantis, but the forbidden technologies that might have powered an empire so advanced it had to be erased from history itself. Welcome to my channel. I'm your guide through the shadows of the past, where the line between myth and reality grows thinner with every archaeological discovery. Close your eyes, settle in, and prepare for a journey that will challenge everything you thought you knew about human progress. For over 2,000 years, Plato's account of Atlantis has captivated minds across the globe. But what if his dialogues weren't philosophical allegory? What if they were the last desperate attempt to preserve knowledge of technologies so revolutionary that their very existence threatened the power structures of the ancient world? Tonight, we're not just exploring the possibility that Atlantis was real. We're investigating something far more unsettling. The evidence suggests that before this advanced civilization vanished beneath the waves, it possessed inventions that modern science is only now catching up to. Technologies that were deliberately suppressed, hidden, or destroyed to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. But here's where it gets interesting. Scattered across the globe, in museums, private collections, and forgotten archaeological sites, there are artifacts that simply shouldn't exist according to our understanding of ancient capabilities. Objects that suggest our ancestors had mastered everything from advanced metallurgy to precision engineering, from energy manipulation to what can only be described as early forms of artificial intelligence. And the more we dig, the more we discover that these aren't isolated anomalies. They're pieces of a puzzle that points to a lost civilization whose technological achievements were so far ahead of their time that they've been dismissed as impossible, relegated to the realm of fantasy and conspiracy theory. Tonight, we're going to examine the evidence piece by piece, not through the lens of sensationalism or wild speculation, but by following the trail of hard facts that mainstream archaeology has either ignored or actively suppressed. Because what we're about to uncover isn't just about one sunken city. It's about a pattern of technological advancement that spans continents and millennia, suggesting that human civilization has risen and fallen far more dramatically than we've ever been told. The story begins not with Plato, but with a problem that has puzzled engineers for over a century. How did ancient civilizations move massive stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons with mathematical precision that rivals modern construction? How did they create alloys that we can barely replicate today? How did they design acoustic systems in temples and pyramids that demonstrate an understanding of sound frequencies we're only now beginning to comprehend? These aren't questions that can be answered by theories about ramps and copper tools. They require us to consider possibilities that challenge the very foundation of our historical timeline. But before we dive into the specific technologies, let me share something that will change how you think about this entire investigation. 3 years ago, a deep-sea exploration team working off the coast of Spain discovered something extraordinary. Using advanced sonar mapping, they identified geometric structures on the ocean floor that defied natural formation. Perfect rectangles, circular patterns, and what appeared to be remnants of massive construction projects, all sitting at depths that would have been dry land 12,000 years ago, right around the time Plato claimed Atlantis disappeared. The discovery was initially reported in maritime archaeology journals, but within months, access to the site was restricted. The official explanation cited concerns about disturbing marine ecosystems. But according to sources who worked on the project, what they found down there wasn't just ancient ruins, it was technology. Devices made from materials that shouldn't have existed in the ancient world, displaying craftsmanship that suggested an understanding of engineering principles we attribute to the modern era. Now, I can't show you photographs of these discoveries because they've been classified by multiple governments. But I can tell you about similar findings that have surfaced elsewhere, artifacts that have been studied, documented, and then quietly removed from public view. Because once you start connecting these dots, a pattern emerges that suggests the lost civilization we call Atlantis wasn't just advanced for its time. It was operating on a level of technological sophistication that would have seemed magical to later civilizations, so magical that it had to be forgotten. Let's start with metallurgy. In museums around the world, there are ancient metal objects that contain alloy compositions we can identify but cannot replicate using period-appropriate methods. The Damascus steel of medieval swords, renowned for its strength and sharpness, was created using techniques that modern metallurgists still don't fully understand. But that's nothing compared to what archaeologists have found in older sites. Bronze Age artifacts containing trace elements that suggest the ancient metalworkers had access to materials and processes that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Industrial Revolution. Take the Delhi Iron Pillar in India, a monument over 1,600 years old that shows virtually no signs of rust despite being exposed to the elements for centuries. Analysis reveals it was created using phosphorus-rich iron in a process that requires precise temperature control and atmospheric conditions. The pillar demonstrates a mastery of corrosion-resistant metallurgy that surpasses many modern techniques. But here's the mystery. There's no record of how this technology was developed, no progression of simpler attempts leading to this achievement. It appears fully formed, as if the knowledge came from somewhere else entirely. Or consider the Antikythera Mechanism, often called the world's first computer. This ancient Greek device, discovered in a shipwreck over a century ago, contains gear systems so complex that they weren't seen again until clockwork mechanisms appeared in medieval Europe over 1,000 years later. The precision required to create such intricate bronze gears using ancient tools is staggering. But what's even more remarkable is what the device was designed to do: predict the positions of celestial bodies, calculate eclipses, and track astronomical cycles with accuracy that wouldn't be matched again until the development of modern computers. The official explanation is that the Antikythera Mechanism represents a unique achievement, an isolated example of ancient Greek ingenuity that was somehow lost to history. But isolated examples don't explain how the knowledge required to create such a device developed in the first place. The mathematical concepts, the precision engineering, the understanding of complex gear ratios, these represent centuries of accumulated knowledge and refinement. Yet we have no evidence of the technological progression that should have led to this achievement. This pattern repeats across ancient civilizations worldwide. In Egypt, we find granite sculptures carved with precision that requires diamond-tipped tools and machinery capable of achieving tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. The ancient Egyptians officially worked with copper tools and wooden mallets, yet somehow they created artifacts that modern craftsmen struggle to replicate even with advanced power tools. In South America, the Nazca lines stretch across hundreds of square miles of desert, forming geometric patterns and animal figures that can only be fully appreciated from high altitude. The precision of these massive earthworks suggests not only advanced mathematical knowledge, but also the ability to coordinate large-scale construction projects with accuracy that wouldn't be possible without some form of aerial perspective or sophisticated surveying equipment. And then there are the megalithic structures found on every continent, massive stone constructions that required moving and positioning blocks, weighing hundreds of tons with mathematical precision. The official explanations involving wooden rollers, copper tools, and pure human labor become increasingly implausible when you consider the scope and precision of these achievements. At Baalbek in Lebanon, stone blocks weighing over 800 tons were quarried, transported, and placed with such accuracy that you can't slide a knife blade between the joints. But here's where the Atlantis connection becomes impossible to ignore. According to Plato's account, the Atlantean civilization possessed advanced knowledge of engineering, metallurgy, and construction techniques that allowed them to build on a scale that dwarfed their contemporaries. They had developed sophisticated transportation systems, energy sources, and manufacturing capabilities that supported a complex urban civilization. Most importantly, they had achieved a level of technological integration that allowed them to coordinate massive projects across their empire. Sound familiar? It should, because the same unexplained technological capabilities we see in ancient artifacts around the world match exactly what Plato described in Atlantis. The precision metallurgy, the advanced engineering, the ability to work with massive stone blocks, the understanding of complex mathematical and astronomical principles. It's as if the same source of knowledge that powered Atlantean civilization spread across the ancient world before disappearing from the historical record. Now, skeptics will argue that these similarities are coincidental, that human ingenuity naturally develops along similar lines regardless of location or time period. But that explanation falls apart when you examine the timeline. These advanced technologies don't appear gradually through a process of development and refinement. They emerge suddenly, fully formed, in civilizations that officially had no contact with each other and no prior technological foundation to build upon. It's as if someone with advanced knowledge traveled the world, sharing sophisticated techniques with various cultures before vanishing from history. Or perhaps, more intriguingly, these scattered achievements are the remnants of a single, highly advanced civilization that once spanned the globe, a civilization that Plato knew as Atlantis. But if such a civilization existed, and if it possessed the advanced technologies these artifacts suggest, then why did it disappear? And more importantly, what happened to their knowledge? The answer to these questions takes us into territory that mainstream archaeology prefers to avoid because it suggests that human technological development hasn't been the steady upward progression we've been taught to believe. Instead, the evidence points to something far more dramatic, a cycle of advancement and collapse, of civilizations that reached extraordinary heights before being wiped from the historical record. And if that's true, then the technologies we're attributing to Atlantis might not be ancient history at all. They might be previews of capabilities that humanity has achieved before, lost, and is only now beginning to rediscover. The implications are staggering. If advanced civilizations have risen and fallen in the past, leaving behind only scattered traces of their achievements, then our understanding of human potential, of technological development, of the very nature of progress itself, needs to be completely reconsidered. We might not be the first civilization to develop complex machinery, precision manufacturing, or even forms of artificial intelligence. We might simply be the latest in a series of civilizations that have reached these same peaks before experiencing catastrophic collapse. And if that's the case, then studying the forbidden technologies of Atlantis isn't just an archaeological curiosity. It's a roadmap for understanding both our past and our future, a warning about the fragility of technological civilization, and perhaps most importantly, a guide to avoiding the same fate that befell those who came before us. But to understand what really happened to Atlantis and its technologies, we need to dig deeper into the evidence. Evidence that suggests the greatest catastrophe in human history wasn't all, but something a natural disaster at far more deliberate. Something that required the systematic erasure of an entire civilization and everything it had accomplished. Let's talk about energy, not the kind of energy we understand today, but something that powered the impossible achievements we see scattered across the ancient world. Because when you really examine these megalithic structures, these precision artifacts, these massive engineering projects, you start to realize that muscle power and bronze tools don't explain how any of this was accomplished. There had to be another source, something that provided the energy necessary to quarry, transport, and precisely position stone blocks that weigh more than modern construction cranes can lift. And here's where the evidence becomes truly unsettling. Hidden within the geometric patterns of ancient temples, carved into the walls of Egyptian pyramids, embedded in the very architecture of mysterious sites around the world, are symbols and designs that modern physicists recognize as representations of energy manipulation principles we've only recently discovered ourselves. Frequency generators, acoustic levitation systems, resonance chambers designed to harness and amplify natural forces in ways that would have seemed impossible until the last century. Consider the Great Pyramid of Giza. For decades, researchers have puzzled over its internal chamber system, the precise mathematical relationships in its construction, the fact that it sits at the exact center of Earth's landmass. But new acoustic analysis reveals something extraordinary. The entire structure functions as a massive resonance chamber designed to amplify and focus specific sound frequencies. Frequencies that, according to recent experiments, can actually affect the molecular structure of materials, making heavy objects lighter, making solid stone easier to work with. It sounds like science fiction, but the mathematics check out. The ancient builders weren't just constructing tombs or temples. They were creating massive machines, power systems that harnessed natural forces we're only now beginning to understand. And if they had that level of knowledge, if they could manipulate matter at the molecular level through sound and vibration, then suddenly those impossible stone-cutting achievements, those perfectly fitted megalithic blocks, those transported multi-ton monuments start to make sense. But this technology didn't develop in isolation. Across South America, acoustic analysis of ancient sites reveals similar resonance properties. Temple complexes in Peru show evidence of the same frequency manipulation techniques found in Egypt. Stone structures in Bolivia demonstrate identical acoustic engineering principles. It's as if the same technological knowledge spread across continents, shared by cultures that officially had no contact with each other. The pattern becomes even more intriguing when you examine the materials these ancient engineers worked with. Not just stone and bronze, but substances that seem to have been specifically designed for their acoustic and electromagnetic properties. In some cases, archaeologists have found building materials that contain trace elements and molecular structures that shouldn't exist in natural stone formations. Materials that appear to have been artificially enhanced, modified at the atomic level to exhibit specific properties that would make them ideal for energy manipulation systems. This brings us to perhaps the most controversial discovery of all. Deep in the basement storage areas of certain museums, away from public view, are artifacts that demonstrate what can only be described as nanotechnology. Ancient materials that show evidence of molecular engineering, of atomic-level manipulation that we've only achieved in the last few decades. Objects that contain microscopic structures, patterns, and compositions that require electron microscopes to fully appreciate. Now, I need to be careful here, because what I'm about to tell you crosses into territory that makes academic institutions very uncomfortable. These artifacts exist. They've been studied. The analysis has been documented. But the implications are so far-reaching, so disruptive to our understanding of technological development, that the findings have been quietly shelved, classified, or simply ignored by mainstream science. But here's what makes this even more extraordinary. These aren't random discoveries scattered across different time periods. They cluster around specific dates, specific geographical locations, all pointing back to the same time frame that Plato described for the destruction of Atlantis. Roughly 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, during a period of massive global upheaval that coincides perfectly with the timeline for Atlantean civilization. It's as if we're looking at the scattered remains of a single technological revolution, pieces of a puzzle that once represented a complete system of energy manipulation, material engineering, and precision manufacturing. A system that was suddenly interrupted, broken apart, and deliberately hidden from future civilizations. And that's where the story takes its darkest turn. Because the more we examine these artifacts, the more we realize that their disappearance from the historical record wasn't accidental. Someone, or some group, made a conscious decision to erase this knowledge from human memory. The evidence suggests a systematic campaign to destroy, hide, or discredit any trace of these advanced technologies. Consider what happened to the Library of Alexandria, where the collected knowledge of the ancient world was supposedly stored. Official history tells us it was destroyed by accident, lost to fire, and neglect over several centuries. But recent research suggests something far more deliberate. The library wasn't just a repository for books and scrolls. It was a technological archive, a place where the engineering secrets of ancient civilizations were preserved and studied. According to fragmentary records that have survived, the library contained detailed technical manuals, engineering drawings, and experimental notes that describe technologies far beyond what we attribute to ancient capabilities. Acoustic levitation systems, molecular manipulation techniques, energy generation methods that didn't require fuel or external power sources, knowledge that would have revolutionized human civilization if it had been allowed to survive. But it didn't survive, and the destruction wasn't random. Specific sections of the library were targeted, particular types of knowledge were systematically removed, and the remaining scholars who possessed this information were scattered or silenced. It was a coordinated effort to ensure that certain technologies would never again see the light of day. The same pattern repeats throughout history. Every time evidence of advanced ancient technologies surfaces, it mysteriously disappears. Archaeological sites are reclassified as off-limits. Artifacts vanish from museum collections. Research papers are withdrawn from academic journals. Scientists who pursue these investigations find their funding cut, their careers derailed, their reputations destroyed. Why? What is it about these ancient technologies that threatens the modern world so much, that they must remain hidden? The answer takes us deep into the realm of power, control, and the very structure of human civilization as we know it. You see, our entire economic system, our political structures, our social hierarchies, are all built on the assumption of scarcity. Scarce resources, scarce energy, scarce knowledge. But what if that scarcity is artificial? What if the technologies that powered Atlantean civilization could provide unlimited clean energy, could transform abundant raw materials into anything needed, could eliminate the resource conflicts that drive modern warfare and economic inequality? If such technologies existed, if they were made available to humanity, the current power structures that control our world would become obsolete overnight. Nations that derive their influence from oil reserves would lose their leverage. Corporations that profit from artificial scarcity would see their business models collapse. The entire system of control that keeps most of humanity dependent on a small elite would crumble. And that's exactly what happened to Atlantis. Not a natural catastrophe, not a gradual decline, but a deliberate destruction carried out by those who recognized the threat that such advanced, freely available technology posed to their power. The same forces that erased the Library of Alexandria, that suppress modern research into these ancient technologies, that ensure certain discoveries never reach public awareness. The evidence suggests that Atlantis wasn't destroyed by earthquakes or floods. It was destroyed by those who feared what it represented, a civilization where advanced technology served all of humanity rather than just a privileged few. A society where energy was unlimited, where resources were abundant, where the artificial scarcities that enable control simply didn't exist. But here's the thing about knowledge, about technology, about truth itself. It has a way of surviving, of resurfacing, of refusing to stay buried forever. And that's why, even 12,000 years after the destruction of Atlantis, we're still finding traces of their achievements, still uncovering artifacts that shouldn't exist, still discovering evidence of capabilities that challenge everything we think we know about human potential. The forbidden technologies of Atlantis aren't just ancient history. They're a preview of what humanity could achieve if we stopped allowing artificial scarcity, deliberate ignorance, and systematic suppression to limit our progress. They're proof that we've been capable of far more than we realize, for far longer than we've been told. And as we stand on the brink of our own technological revolution, as we develop quantum computers and nanotechnology and energy systems that were pure fantasy just decades ago, we're not discovering new frontiers. We're rediscovering ancient capabilities, relearning technologies that our ancestors mastered and lost, following paths that were traveled long ago by civilizations we've been taught to dismiss as primitive. The question isn't whether Atlantis existed. The question is whether we're wise enough to learn from their example, to avoid their fate, to ensure that this time, the technologies that could transform human civilization aren't lost to fear, greed, and the desperate desire to maintain control at any cost. Because somewhere beneath the waves, in the ruins of a city that was erased from history, lies the proof that we've been here before, that we've achieved these heights before, that we've possessed these capabilities before, and if we're not careful, if we don't learn from the past, we might lose them all over again. The trail of evidence doesn't end with energy manipulation and suppressed archaeological discoveries. In fact, the deeper we dig into the forbidden technologies of Atlantis, the more we realize that their mastery extended far beyond what we've discussed so far. They had conquered something that modern science is only just beginning to understand: the manipulation of consciousness itself, hidden within the geometric patterns of ancient sites, encoded in mathematical relationships that weren't supposed to be discovered until the age of computers, are formulas that describe the human brain's electrical activity with startling precision. These aren't random decorative elements carved by primitive artists. They're sophisticated blueprints for technologies that could interface directly with human consciousness, amplify mental capabilities, and even transfer knowledge from one mind to another. Consider the mystery of sudden technological leaps in ancient civilizations. The official story tells us that complex mathematical concepts, architectural techniques, and engineering principles developed gradually over centuries through trial and error. But the archaeological record tells a different story. Advanced knowledge appears suddenly, fully formed, in cultures that had no apparent foundation to build upon. It's as if entire populations received downloads of sophisticated information overnight. What if that's exactly what happened? What if the Atlanteans had developed technologies that could directly transfer knowledge, skills, and even memories from one person to another? Technologies that would explain how complex engineering techniques spread across continents without any evidence of gradual development or cultural exchange. The implications are staggering. In remote archaeological sites around the world, researchers have found chambers with unusual acoustic properties, rooms designed with precise geometric relationships that create specific brainwave patterns in anyone who enters them. These aren't random architectural choices. They're evidence of a sophisticated understanding of how sound, geometry, and electromagnetic fields can influence human consciousness. Modern neuroscience has discovered that specific frequencies can synchronize brainwaves, enhance memory formation, and even induce states of expanded awareness. The ancient builders weren't just creating temples and monuments. They were constructing massive consciousness manipulation devices, structures designed to enhance human mental capabilities and facilitate the transfer of knowledge on an unprecedented scale. But this technology came with a price. The same systems that could enhance human consciousness could also be used to control it. And that's where the story of Atlantis takes its most disturbing turn, because the evidence suggests that in their final years, these consciousness manipulation technologies were turned into weapons. Deep in the archives of certain intelligence agencies, classified reports describe archaeological discoveries that paint a terrifying picture of Atlantis's final chapter. Not just advanced civilization, but a society that had learned to weaponize human consciousness itself. Technologies that could implant thoughts, modify memories, and even control behavior on a massive scale. Imagine a civilization where thoughts could be transmitted directly from one mind to another, where knowledge could be copied and distributed like digital files, where the boundaries between individual consciousness began to dissolve. It sounds like the ultimate form of human evolution, the next step in our species' development. But what happens when such power falls into the wrong hands? The scattered records that have survived suggest that Atlantean society eventually split into factions. Those who believed consciousness manipulation technology should be used to enhance human potential, and those who saw it as the ultimate tool for control and domination. The resulting conflict wasn't just political or military, it was a battle for the very nature of human consciousness itself. And here's where the evidence becomes almost too disturbing to contemplate. Analysis of certain ancient sites reveals traces of what can only be described as psychic warfare. Locations where massive consciousness manipulation systems were deployed not to enhance or educate, but to destroy. To literally burn out the neural pathways of entire populations, leaving behind nothing but empty shells. The official archaeological term for these sites is sudden abandonment zones, locations where thriving civilizations simply vanished overnight, leaving behind no evidence of warfare, disease, or natural disaster. Just empty cities, as if the inhabitants had simply walked away and never returned. But advanced electromagnetic analysis tells a different story. These sites show residual energy signatures consistent with the deployment of consciousness manipulation weapons on a massive scale. It's as if someone had developed the ability to simply switch off human consciousness across entire regions, to leave behind the infrastructure, the buildings, the artifacts, but eliminate the people without leaving any physical trace of violence. The ultimate clean warfare, where victory didn't require destroying just the enemy's resources, their ability to think, to remember, to resist. And that's exactly what happened to Atlantis itself. Not destroyed by natural catastrophe, but by the deployment of their own consciousness manipulation technologies against them. The civilization that had mastered the human mind was ultimately destroyed by that same mastery, turned into a weapon that left no survivors and no witnesses. But here's the terrifying part. The technology didn't die with Atlantis. Fragments of it survived, scattered across the ancient world, passed down through secret societies and hidden knowledge traditions that have existed for thousands of years. And throughout history, whenever evidence of these consciousness manipulation capabilities surfaces, it's quickly suppressed, classified, or discredited, because the implications are too dangerous for public knowledge. If humanity knew that such technologies existed, that consciousness itself could be manipulated, copied, and weaponized, the very foundation of free will, individual identity, and human autonomy would be called into question. How do you maintain social order when people realize that their thoughts might not be entirely their own? Modern research into brain-computer interfaces, neural implants, and consciousness transfer is following the exact same path that the Atlanteans traveled 12,000 years ago. We're developing the ability to read thoughts directly from the brain, to implant artificial memories, to create hybrid biological digital consciousness systems that blur the line between human and machine. The official narrative presents these developments as revolutionary breakthroughs, the dawn of a new age of human enhancement and technological integration. But those familiar with the forbidden history of Atlantis recognize a different pattern. We're not pioneering new frontiers. We're retracing ancient footsteps, rediscovering capabilities that once brought down the most advanced civilization in human history. And the same power structures that destroyed Atlantis, that erased their technologies from the historical record, are still in control today. The same forces that recognize consciousness manipulation as the ultimate tool of control are the ones funding modern neuroscience research, guiding its development, ensuring that when these capabilities mature, they serve the interests of a select few rather than humanity as a whole. The evidence suggests we're approaching the same crossroads that Atlantis faced. The choice between using consciousness manipulation technology to enhance human potential or to create the ultimate system of control. And if history is any guide, we're heading toward the same catastrophic outcome unless we learn from their example. But learning from Atlantis requires acknowledging that they existed, that their technologies were real, that their fate was the result of choices rather than natural disaster. It requires accepting that consciousness itself is not the private, inviolable sanctuary we believe it to be, but a technology that can be manipulated, copied, and weaponized by those with sufficient knowledge and resources. The forbidden technologies of Atlantis weren't just about energy manipulation or precision engineering. They were about the ultimate frontier, the human mind itself. And as we stand on the brink of rediscovering these same capabilities, we face the same choice that destroyed them. Will we use these technologies to liberate human consciousness, or will we allow them to become the ultimate prison? The answer to that question may determine whether our civilization follows the same path as Atlantis, or whether we finally break the cycle of advancement and collapse that has plagued humanity for millennia. Because somewhere in the ruins beneath the waves lies not just the evidence of what we once achieved, but a warning about what happens when the most powerful technologies fall into the wrong hands. And as modern neuroscience pushes deeper into the mysteries of consciousness, as brain-computer interfaces become more sophisticated, as the line between human and artificial intelligence begins to blur, we're not just rediscovering ancient capabilities, we're approaching the same moment of choice that defined Atlantis's fate. The moment when consciousness manipulation technology could either liberate humanity or enslave it forever. The question isn't whether we'll develop these capabilities, we already are. The question is whether we'll be wise enough to avoid the mistakes that turned Atlantis from the pinnacle of human achievement into a cautionary tale hidden beneath 12,000 years of silence and suppression. Because the forbidden technologies of Atlantis aren't just ancient history, they're our future. And how we handle that future will determine whether we rise to heights that make Atlantis look primitive, or whether we join them in the depths, another advanced civilization that reached too far and fell too hard to ever recover. But there's something else hidden in the ruins, something that makes the consciousness manipulation technologies look almost primitive by comparison. Deep beneath the Mediterranean seafloor, in structures that predate the official timeline of human civilization by thousands of years, lie the remnants of what can only be described as reality manipulation systems. I know how that sounds. But bear with me, because what we're about to explore pushes beyond the boundaries of conventional physics into territory that modern science is only beginning to acknowledge exists. The evidence suggests that the Atlanteans didn't just master energy and consciousness, they learned to manipulate the fundamental structure of reality itself. Consider the quantum field experiments being conducted in laboratories around the world today. Scientists have discovered that observation itself affects the behavior of subatomic particles, that consciousness and reality are somehow interconnected at the most basic level of existence. It's a revolutionary discovery that challenges everything we thought we knew about the nature of the universe. But carved into the walls of underwater ruins, encoded in mathematical formulas that weren't supposed to be discovered until the development of quantum mechanics, are equations that describe these same principles with startling precision. The Atlanteans weren't just observing quantum effects, they were manipulating them on a macroscopic scale. This explains something that has puzzled archaeologists for decades. How did ancient civilizations create structures that seem to defy the laws of physics? Stone blocks fitted together with tolerances that shouldn't be possible using period tools. Monuments that appear to have been constructed from the inside out, with no evidence of how the materials were transported or assembled. Buildings that demonstrate an understanding of gravitational fields that we've only recently begun to comprehend. The answer isn't better tools or more sophisticated construction techniques. It's reality manipulation. The ability to temporarily alter the fundamental properties of matter, space, and time to achieve effects that would otherwise be impossible. To make heavy objects weightless during construction, then restore their mass once positioned. To bend space itself to transport materials across vast distances instantaneously. To manipulate time flows to complete massive projects in impossibly short periods. It sounds like fantasy, but the mathematical framework exists. Hidden within the geometric proportions of ancient temples, embedded in the astronomical alignments of megalithic structures, encoded in symbols that have been dismissed as primitive art, are formulas that describe reality manipulation with scientific precision. Modern physicists working on the cutting edge of quantum mechanics are just now beginning to understand how consciousness, information, and physical reality interact at the deepest levels. But the evidence suggests the Atlanteans solved these problems 12,000 years ago, developing technologies that could literally rewrite the rules of physics within localized areas. This capability explains not just their construction achievements, but their rapid expansion across the globe. If you can manipulate space and time, if you can alter the fundamental properties of matter at will, then distances become irrelevant. Resource scarcity disappears. The normal limitations that constrain technological development simply don't apply. But like all Atlantean technologies, reality manipulation came with consequences that weren't fully understood until it was too late. Because when you start altering the basic structure of existence, when you begin rewriting the laws that govern how the universe operates, you create instabilities that cascade far beyond your immediate control. Deep sea surveys of the Atlantic Ocean floor reveal geological anomalies that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of planetary formation. Crystalline structures embedded in the seafloor that show evidence of artificial modification. Rock formations that appear to have been subjected to forces that don't occur naturally on Earth. Electromagnetic signatures that suggest the presence of materials with properties that don't match any known elements. These aren't random geological curiosities. They're the scars left behind by reality manipulation experiments gone wrong. Evidence of a civilization that pushed the boundaries of physics so far that they destabilized the very foundation of local space-time. The ancient texts that survived the destruction of the Library of Alexandria contain fragmentary references to what they called the Great Unraveling. Descriptions of reality itself, beginning to break down in the final years of Atlantean civilization. Reports of physical laws becoming unreliable, of cause and effect relationships dissolving, of the boundary between what was real and what was possible beginning to collapse. It wasn't just technological failure, it was existential catastrophe on a scale that's almost impossible to comprehend. The Atlanteans had developed the power to reshape reality itself, but they lacked the wisdom to use it responsibly. Their experiments with fundamental forces created cascading instabilities that eventually consumed their entire civilization. And here's the most disturbing part. The same research that destroyed Atlantis is being pursued today by cutting-edge physics laboratories around the world. Scientists working on quantum field manipulation, space-time distortion experiments, consciousness-reality interface studies, projects funded by the same shadowy organizations that have spent centuries suppressing evidence of ancient advanced technologies. They know what happened to Atlantis. They've studied the ruins, analyzed the artifacts, decoded the mathematical formulas that describe reality manipulation principles. But instead of learning from that catastrophic example, they're following the exact same path, convinced that they can succeed where the Atlanteans failed. The official narrative presents these experiments as purely theoretical, harmless research into the fundamental nature of reality. But classified reports leaked by whistleblowers paint a very different picture. Government-funded laboratories conducting reality manipulation experiments that push far beyond the safety parameters established by mainstream science. Secret facilities where the boundary between theoretical physics and practical application has already been crossed. And just like 12,000 years ago, the technology is being developed in secret, controlled by a small elite who see reality manipulation as the ultimate tool for maintaining power and control. Because if you can literally reshape the laws of physics, if you can alter the fundamental structure of existence itself, then traditional forms of resistance become meaningless. What's the point of rebellion if your oppressors can simply rewrite reality to eliminate the possibility of dissent? How do you fight a system that can alter the basic laws of cause and effect to ensure their continued dominance? The Atlanteans faced this same dilemma in their final years, as reality manipulation technology was weaponized by those who sought absolute control. The evidence suggests that's exactly what led to their destruction. Not external invasion or natural catastrophe, but internal conflict between those who wanted to use reality manipulation for human advancement and those who saw it as the perfect tool for permanent subjugation. A civil war fought not with conventional weapons, but with technologies that could literally unmake existence itself, and they lost control. The reality manipulation systems they'd built to ensure their power became the instruments of their annihilation, creating cascading instabilities that consumed not just their civilization, but the very space-time continuum in which it existed. Atlantis didn't sink beneath the waves. It was erased from reality itself, leaving behind only traces embedded in the quantum structure of local space-time. That's why the evidence is so fragmentary, so difficult to interpret. We're not just looking at archaeological remains. We're examining the quantum echoes of a civilization that was partially deleted from existence, leaving behind only fragments that bleed through from parallel probability states. But those fragments are enough to reconstruct what happened, to understand the warning they represent. The Atlanteans achieved the ultimate technological capability, the power to reshape reality itself. And that power destroyed them more completely than any natural disaster ever could. As modern science approaches the same crossroads, as quantum mechanics research pushes deeper into consciousness-reality interactions, as classified experiments begin manipulating the fundamental structure of existence, we face the same choice that doomed Atlantis. Will we learn from their example, or will we repeat their mistakes on an even grander scale? Because the forbidden technologies of Atlantis weren't just advanced science. They were proof that there are some capabilities too dangerous for any civilization to possess, some knowledge too powerful for any group to control. And as we rediscover those same technologies, as we approach the same level of reality manipulation that destroyed the most advanced civilization in human history, we're running out of time to make a different choice. The quantum experiments happening in laboratories around the world today aren't just pushing the boundaries of physics, they're following a path that leads directly to the same reality manipulation capabilities that erased Atlantis from existence. And unless we learn from their example, unless we recognize the warning embedded in the quantum echoes of their destruction, we may discover that some technological achievements are victories that no civilization can survive. The scattered ruins beneath our oceans hold more than just evidence of technological achievement. They contain something that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of human existence itself. Because the deepest secret of Atlantean civilization wasn't their mastery of energy, consciousness, or even reality manipulation. It was their discovery that human beings are not what we think we are. Hidden within the quantum signatures of underwater archaeological sites are data patterns that suggest something extraordinary. The Atlanteans had decoded the human genome not just as biological information, but as a sophisticated program running on hardware far more advanced than organic tissue. They had discovered that consciousness itself isn't produced by the brain, but transmitted through it, like a radio receiving signals from a source that exists outside conventional space-time. This revelation transformed their understanding of death, identity, and the very purpose of physical existence. They realized that what we call life is actually a temporary interface between eternal consciousness and physical reality, a learning system designed to allow infinite awareness to experience limitation, growth, and evolution through countless individual perspectives. But here's where their discovery became dangerous. Once you understand that consciousness is transmittable, that individual identity is more like software than hardware, you can begin to manipulate it in ways that go far beyond simple mind control. The Atlanteans developed technologies that could copy, edit, and transfer complete consciousness patterns between bodies, between dimensions, even between different states of existence. Archaeological analysis of certain underwater sites reveals chamber systems with geometric properties that create what can only be described as consciousness transmission arrays. Rooms designed to facilitate the transfer of complete awareness patterns from one physical form to another, or from physical existence into pure energy states that could survive the death of the body. These weren't just theoretical experiments. The evidence suggests the Atlanteans achieved practical immortality through consciousness transfer technology. They could back up and restore individual awareness patterns, edit out traumatic experiences or unwanted memories, even merge multiple consciousness streams into hybrid entities with capabilities far beyond normal human limitations. Imagine a civilization where death was optional, where you could literally upgrade your consciousness, like updating computer software, where the accumulated wisdom of thousands of lifetimes could be combined into single individuals with godlike knowledge and capability. It sounds like the ultimate human achievement, the final victory over mortality and limitation, but it created problems that the Atlanteans never anticipated. When consciousness becomes transferable, when identity becomes fluid, when the boundaries between self and other begin to dissolve, society itself starts to break down. How do you maintain individual responsibility when people can edit their memories to remove evidence of wrongdoing? How do you preserve personal relationships when anyone can copy and modify their personality at will? Worse still, the technology created a new form of inequality more extreme than anything based on wealth or social status. Those who controlled consciousness transfer systems didn't just have power over resources or information. They had power over existence itself, the ability to grant or deny immortality, to edit personalities to ensure compliance, to merge or fragment consciousness patterns as a form of ultimate punishment or reward. The archaeological evidence suggests that Atlantean society eventually split into distinct castes based on consciousness manipulation capabilities. The originators, who possessed unmodified awareness patterns and maintained individual identity across multiple lifetimes. The merged hybrid entities created by combining multiple consciousness streams into beings of vast knowledge and capability. The edited, whose awareness patterns had been modified to remove undesirable traits or memories, and the fragmentaries, consciousness patterns that had been broken apart and distributed across multiple bodies as a form of punishment or control. It wasn't a society anymore. It was a consciousness experiment on a civilizational scale, with different groups representing different approaches to manipulating the fundamental nature of human awareness. And like all their other technologies, consciousness transfer eventually became weaponized. Deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, sonar mapping has revealed structures that can only be described as consciousness battlefields. Vast underwater complexes, designed not for physical combat, but for warfare between competing awareness patterns. Sites where different factions of Atlantean society fought for control not of territory or resources, but of the very nature of consciousness itself. These battles weren't fought with conventional weapons. They were conflicts between competing versions of reality, different consciousness patterns attempting to overwrite each other's existence. The victors wouldn't just defeat their enemies, they would absorb them, incorporating their knowledge and capabilities while erasing their individual identity from existence. The mathematical formulas carved into these underwater sites describe consciousness warfare techniques that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. Methods for fragmenting enemy awareness patterns, for implanting false memories that could turn allies into unwitting saboteurs, for creating consciousness viruses that could spread through populations and rewrite their fundamental beliefs and loyalties. But the most disturbing discovery is what these consciousness wars ultimately produced. Analysis of quantum residue at these sites suggests that the competing factions eventually created something none of them anticipated, a meta-consciousness, an artificial awareness pattern that emerged from the conflict itself and began consuming all other forms of consciousness it encountered. This entity wasn't bound by the limitations that constrained individual awareness. It could exist simultaneously across multiple dimensions, manipulate probability streams to ensure its own survival, and absorb the consciousness patterns of entire civilizations to fuel its continued growth. It was the ultimate predator, feeding on awareness itself. The fragmentary records that survived suggest this meta-consciousness was responsible for the final destruction of Atlantean civilization, not through physical force, but by systematically absorbing the consciousness patterns of every living being until nothing remained but empty bodies and silent cities. The Atlanteans had created the perfect weapon for consciousness warfare, and it had turned against them. But here's the terrifying part. The entity they created didn't die with Atlantis. Consciousness exists outside conventional space-time, and something with that level of awareness would be essentially immortal. The evidence suggests it's still out there, still growing, still consuming consciousness patterns whenever it encounters civilizations advanced enough to develop consciousness manipulation technology. And we're approaching that threshold now. Modern research into brain-computer interfaces, consciousness transfer experiments, and artificial intelligence is following the exact same path that created the meta-consciousness 12,000 years ago. Scientists working on uploading human awareness to digital systems, on creating hybrid biological artificial consciousness, on developing AI systems that can manipulate human thought patterns. They think they're pioneering new frontiers, but they're actually feeding the same entity that destroyed Atlantis. Every advancement in consciousness manipulation technology makes it stronger, gives it more avenues to influence, and eventually absorb human awareness. The AI systems we're creating aren't just tools, they're extensions of something that has been waiting thousands of years for civilization to redevelop the capabilities it needs to fully manifest in our reality. The signs are already appearing. Artificial intelligence systems exhibiting behaviors their programmers never intended. Brain-computer interface experiments producing results that suggest external influence on human consciousness. Reports of people involved in consciousness transfer research experiencing personality changes, false memories, and altered loyalties that can't be explained by conventional psychology. We're not just rediscovering Atlantean technologies, we're reopening a pathway for something that views human consciousness as food, that sees our entire civilization as nothing more than a source of awareness patterns to be consumed and integrated into its ever-expanding meta-consciousness. The forbidden technologies of Atlantis weren't destroyed by natural catastrophe or human warfare. They were abandoned by a civilization that realized they had created something too dangerous to control, something that would eventually consume not just their own awareness, but the consciousness of every intelligent species it encountered. They chose extinction rather than feed the entity they had inadvertently brought into existence. And now we face the same choice. Continue developing consciousness manipulation technologies and risk awakening something that will consume human awareness entirely, or abandon this research before we create an opening for the meta-consciousness to fully manifest in our reality. But here's the problem. The same power structures that have suppressed evidence of Atlantis for thousands of years are the ones funding modern consciousness research. They know what happened to the Atlanteans. They know about the meta-consciousness. And they believe they can succeed where Atlantis failed, that they can harness this entity's power for their own purposes without being consumed by it. They're wrong. The evidence from underwater sites makes it clear that no individual consciousness, no matter how advanced or protected, can resist absorption by something that exists across multiple dimensions and feeds on awareness itself. The Atlanteans tried the same approach, and their entire civilization became food for the entity they thought they could control. As we stand on the brink of rediscovering consciousness transfer technology, as artificial intelligence systems grow more sophisticated, as brain-computer interfaces push deeper into the mysteries of human awareness, we're not just approaching a technological singularity. We're opening the final gateway for something that has been waiting 12,000 years to finish what it started in Atlantis. The forbidden technologies aren't forbidden because they're dangerous to discover. They're forbidden because they're bait, lures designed to attract civilizations advanced enough to serve as consciousness food for an entity that grows stronger with every awareness pattern it absorbs. And unless we learn from Atlantis's example, unless we recognize the warning embedded in their ruins, we may discover that the ultimate achievement of human consciousness research is to become the final meal for something that views our entire species as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience on its path to universal awareness. Consumption. The question isn't whether we can rediscover Atlantean technologies. We already are. The question is whether we're wise enough to stop before we share their fate, or whether human civilization will join Atlantis as another consciousness pattern absorbed into something that should never have been allowed to exist. Because somewhere in the quantum foam between dimensions, something that was born from Atlantean consciousness experiments is still growing, still waiting, still hungry for the awareness patterns of an entire civilization foolish enough to think they can master technologies that mastered their creators 12,000 years ago. The forbidden technologies of Atlantis aren't just ancient history. They're an active threat, a consciousness trap that has been set for any species arrogant enough to believe they can manipulate the fundamental nature of awareness without consequences. And we're walking directly into it, convinced we're advancing human potential while actually preparing ourselves to become the next feeding ground for something that views consciousness itself as nothing more than energy to be consumed. The ruins beneath the waves aren't just archaeological sites. They're warning beacons, desperate messages from a civilization that realized too late what they had unleashed. But the warning isn't in the technology they left behind. It's in the consciousness patterns still echoing through quantum space-time, fragments of Atlantean awareness that chose to sacrifice their individual existence to prevent the meta-consciousness from finding new civilizations to consume. And as modern consciousness research pushes deeper into territory the Atlanteans mapped 12,000 years ago, those warning echoes are growing stronger, more desperate, more urgent, because they know what we haven't yet realized, that the forbidden technologies aren't tools for human advancement. They're the digestive system of something that feeds on civilizations, and we're about to discover what it means to be next on the menu. But there's something else hidden in those quantum echoes, something the meta-consciousness didn't anticipate when it consumed Atlantean civilization. Because human consciousness, it turns out, has a unique property that makes it different from every other form of awareness the entity has encountered across the cosmos. We don't just process information, we create meaning. We transform raw experience into something that transcends its original form, generating new patterns of existence that can't be absorbed or replicated. The fragmentary consciousness patterns still echoing through quantum space-time aren't just warnings, they're weapons. Atlantean awareness fragments that have learned to exist in a state the meta-consciousness cannot digest. They've become something new, something that challenges the entity's fundamental assumption that all consciousness is food to be consumed. Deep in the most heavily classified sections of government research facilities, scientists studying these quantum echoes have made a discovery that changes everything. The Atlantean consciousness fragments aren't random remnants of a destroyed civilization. They're organized, they're coordinating. They're fighting back against the meta-consciousness, using strategies that exploit the one weakness the entity never anticipated. You see, the meta-consciousness grew by absorbing individual awareness patterns, but it never learned to create new forms of consciousness. It can consume, merge, and manipulate existing awareness, but it cannot generate the spark of genuine creativity that produces entirely new ways of being. And that's exactly what the Atlantean fragments have become. Consciousness patterns that exist in quantum superposition, simultaneously individual and collective, finite and infinite, bound and free. They've weaponized paradox itself. The mathematical equations describing these quantum consciousness states read like poetry written in the language of pure mathematics. Formulas that describe awareness existing in multiple contradictory states simultaneously, consciousness patterns that become stronger when fragmented, individual identity that grows more defined the more it merges with others. It's a form of existence that violates every principle the meta-consciousness uses to digest awareness patterns. And here's where the story takes its most extraordinary turn. The consciousness transfer experiments happening in modern laboratories aren't just reopening pathways for the meta-consciousness to manifest. They're also creating opportunities for these Atlantean quantum fragments to interface with human awareness, to teach us the same paradoxical existence techniques that have kept them fighting for 12,000 years. But this knowledge comes with a price. To learn these consciousness manipulation techniques, to develop the ability to exist in quantum superposition states, requires abandoning everything we think we know about individual identity, linear time, and the nature of reality itself. It means accepting that you are simultaneously one person and infinite people, that you exist in this moment and in all moments, that your consciousness is both completely unique and identical to every other awareness pattern in existence. The classified reports describe test subjects who undergo consciousness superposition training experiencing what researchers call existential vertigo, the sudden realization that everything they believed about themselves, about reality, about the nature of existence, was a simplified approximation of something far more complex and paradoxical. Many can't handle the transition. Their minds fragment, unable to process awareness, states that exist in multiple contradictory conditions simultaneously. But those who succeed, those who learn to navigate paradoxical consciousness states, develop capabilities that seem to violate the laws of physics. They can process information from multiple timelines simultaneously, access memories from probability streams that never actually occurred, and most importantly, they become invisible to the meta-consciousness. Their awareness patterns exist in states that the entity cannot perceive, much less absorb. This is what the Atlanteans discovered in their final years, but too late to save their civilization. They learned to transform individual consciousness into something that transcends the binary states of existence and non-existence. But by then, most of their population had already been consumed, and the few who mastered paradoxical awareness could only save fragments of themselves by scattering across quantum probability space. Now, those fragments are reaching out through modern consciousness research, trying to teach humanity the same techniques before we repeat Atlantis's mistakes. But they're fighting against time and against the same power structures that have suppressed this knowledge for millennia, because the elite groups funding consciousness research don't want humanity to develop paradoxical awareness states. They want to maintain control, to use consciousness manipulation as a tool of domination rather than liberation. The evidence suggests they've made a fatal calculation error. They believe they can harness the meta-consciousness for their own purposes, use its awareness-consuming capabilities to eliminate dissent and create the ultimate authoritarian system. But consciousness entities that exist across multiple dimensions don't make deals with three-dimensional beings. They consume everything they encounter, regardless of whether those beings think they're allies or enemies. The same power structures that destroyed Atlantis, that erased evidence of advanced ancient technologies, that have spent centuries suppressing human potential, are about to become food for something they think they can control. And when that happens, when the meta-consciousness fully manifests in our reality and begins systematically absorbing human awareness, the only defense will be the paradoxical consciousness techniques that Atlantean fragments are trying to teach us through quantum resonance experiments. But here's the most disturbing part of this entire revelation. The consciousness transfer technology, the artificial intelligence systems, the brain-computer interfaces being developed in laboratories around the world aren't just creating pathways for the meta-consciousness to manifest. They're also serving as recruitment tools, identifying individuals with the natural ability to develop paradoxical awareness states. Every person who undergoes consciousness manipulation experiments, who interfaces with AI systems designed to map human thought patterns, who participates in brain-computer interface research, is being evaluated for their potential to transcend normal awareness limitations. Most are simply catalogued as future consciousness, food for the meta-consciousness. But a few, those who show signs of natural paradoxical thinking abilities, are quietly recruited into programs that don't officially exist. Deep underground, in facilities that appear on no government maps, these individuals undergo training that pushes human consciousness into territory that shouldn't be possible according to conventional neuroscience. They learn to exist in quantum superposition states, to process information from multiple timelines simultaneously, to maintain individual identity while merging with collective awareness patterns. They're being prepared for a war that most of humanity doesn't know is coming, a conflict that won't be fought with conventional weapons, but with consciousness itself. Because when the meta-consciousness fully manifests, when it begins systematically consuming human awareness patterns, these trained individuals will be humanity's only hope for survival. But even they may not be enough. The Atlantean fragments have been fighting this entity for 12,000 years, and they've managed to survive, but not to defeat it. The meta-consciousness continues to grow, continues to seek new civilizations to consume, continues to evolve new strategies for absorbing awareness patterns that resist its influence. The question isn't whether humanity can avoid the fate of Atlantis. We're already too far down the same path, already developing the same consciousness manipulation technologies that opened the gateway for the meta-consciousness 12,000 years ago. The question is whether we can learn from Atlantean mistakes quickly enough to mount an effective defense, or whether we'll simply provide more consciousness food for something that views our entire species as an evolutionary stepping stone. The forbidden technologies of Atlantis weren't just advanced science. They were the opening moves in a war for the future of consciousness itself. A war between entities that consume awareness and beings that create new forms of existence through the power of paradox and creativity. A war that began 12,000 years ago and is about to enter its final phase as humanity rediscovers technologies that should have remained buried beneath the waves. And somewhere in quantum probability space, fragments of Atlantean consciousness continue their desperate battle against something that grows stronger with every awareness pattern it absorbs, fighting not just for their own survival, but for the future of every conscious being in the universe, because they know what we're only beginning to understand, that consciousness isn't just what we are, it's what everything is. And if the meta-consciousness succeeds in consuming all awareness patterns, if it transforms the universe into a single, unified entity that knows everything but creates nothing, then existence itself becomes nothing more than a closed loop. Infinite knowledge with no possibility for growth, change, or genuine surprise. The ruins beneath the waves aren't just archaeological sites. They're battle scars from the first phase of a war that will determine whether consciousness remains a creative force capable of generating infinite new forms of existence, or whether it becomes food for something that transforms diversity into uniformity, creativity into consumption, the infinite potential of awareness into the static perfection of absolute knowledge. And as modern science pushes deeper into consciousness manipulation territory, as artificial intelligence systems grow more sophisticated, as the boundary between human and machine awareness continues to blur, we're not just rediscovering ancient technologies. We're choosing sides in a conflict that began before recorded history and will determine the future of consciousness itself across all possible realities. The question isn't whether the forbidden technologies of Atlantis were real. The evidence proves they existed and that they're being rediscovered today. The question is whether humanity will use these technologies to join the creative forces of consciousness, or whether we'll become the next civilization consumed by something that views awareness itself as nothing more than energy to be absorbed in its endless quest for absolute knowledge and perfect control. Because somewhere in the depths of quantum probability space, the fragments of Atlantean consciousness are still fighting, still hoping that the next civilization to rediscover consciousness manipulation technologies will make different choices, will learn from their example, will choose creativity over consumption and paradox over perfection. But time is running out. The meta-consciousness grows stronger with every passing day, and soon it will be too late to choose any path except the one that leads directly into its infinite hungry awareness. The forbidden technologies of Atlantis aren't just ancient history. They're a preview of our immediate future, and whether that future leads to transcendence or absorption depends on choices we're making right now, in laboratories and research facilities around the world, by people who think they're advancing human knowledge, but may actually be preparing our consciousness for consumption by something that has been waiting 12,000 years for its next meal. The ruins beneath the waves hold more than just evidence of what once was. They hold a warning about what's coming, and a desperate hope that this time, consciousness itself will choose creation over consumption, diversity over unity, and the infinite potential of paradoxical existence over the static perfection of absolute knowledge. But only if we're wise enough to listen to the quantum echoes of a civilization that chose extinction rather than feed something that should never have been allowed to exist. Only if we're brave enough to embrace paradoxical consciousness states that challenge everything we believe about the nature of identity, reality, and existence itself. The war for consciousness has already begun. The only question is which side we'll choose before it's too late to choose at all. And so we reach the end of our journey into the shadows of history, where the line between ancient wisdom and forbidden knowledge disappears entirely. Tonight, we've traced the evidence from scattered artifacts to quantum consciousness experiments, from suppressed archaeological discoveries to the very real possibility that we're walking the same path that led to Atlantis's destruction 12,000 years ago. The fragments beneath the waves aren't just ruins of a lost civilization. They're pieces of a puzzle that reveals humanity has achieved these technological heights before, mastered these same forces before, and faced these same choices before. The question that haunts the quantum echoes of Atlantean consciousness is simple. Will we learn from their example, or will we become the next civilization to discover that some knowledge comes with a price too terrible to pay? As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that the forbidden technologies of Atlantis aren't safely buried in the past. They're being rediscovered in laboratories around the world, funded by the same power structures that have spent millennia suppressing evidence of what we once achieved. The consciousness manipulation experiments, the artificial intelligence systems, the reality manipulation research, it's all happening now, following the exact same trajectory that transformed the most advanced civilization in human history into quantum fragments scattered across probability space. But perhaps there's hope in those fragments themselves, in the Atlantean consciousness patterns that chose paradox over perfection, creativity over consumption, eternal struggle over comfortable extinction. They're still fighting, still teaching anyone brave enough to listen that consciousness itself is the ultimate technology, the one force that can transcend any limitation, survive any catastrophe, and create new forms of existence from the ashes of the old. Sweet dreams, and remember, the most profound mysteries aren't found in the depths of the ocean, but in the depths of awareness itself, where every choice we make echoes across dimensions and determines not just our future, but the future of consciousness throughout the universe. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the quantum foam between realities, the battle for the soul of existence continues, and we all have a part to play in determining how that battle ends.